All right, folks. So my name is Mike Doobie. I run streaming media for NPR, and I'm happy to be here today. This panel is actually the first panel where the Emmys is doing a cooperation with Streaming Media East. So this is actually an Emmy-produced panel, so I thank you for joining us. There's a subgroup within the Emmys called IMPG. I'm a member of that Emmy subgroup, and we're dedicated to the advancement of TV in all its forms across devices. I'm reading off our spiel here, including VR, AR, OTT, SVOD, social, and second screen. And we award Emmys in 5 areas to projects in all of these areas and bring together a diverse group of 800 professionals in TV and interactive. The reason why I'm mentioning this to you is because we're looking to increase membership. So at some point, if any of you are interested in becoming or applying for membership to the Emmys, I encourage you to come up to me afterwards, and I'll connect you with the right folks. After this panel, there's a short break, and then there's actually in this room afterwards the second of our 2 Emmys produced panels here today at Streaming Media East. So thanks again for joining us. So we did have one person who couldn't join us today from the panel, according to your documentation, but we do have a great group of content owners and creators here today. So first to my left is Nathan Phillips. He's a collaborator for Google Labs. Thanks for being here, Nate. Mm-hmm. And I also have next to him is Jonathan Doob, who is GM for Digital and Head of OTT Business at William Morris Endeavors IMG. And then finally, at the end of the line here, I have Isaac Josephson, who's VP of Product Management, Apps and Emerging Technology for Viacom. So again, thanks for joining us. We're missing one panelist, but I think we're not going to have a problem. I think we have plenty of stuff that we can go over. So guys, first, if you can, could you please reintroduce yourselves and then tell us a little bit about what you do and what you're doing at your respective endeavors.
Yeah, should I go first?
Sure.
Sweet. I'm Emmy winner Nathan Phillips. I like to introduce myself that way whenever I get the opportunity. This seemed like a good opportunity. I am a collaborator, one of many right now with Google Creative Labs, but you should know that anything I say today is not on behalf of that organization. It's just like my own personal take on the world at large. Previous to that, I was the chief creative officer at a place called Narrative, which is an advertising agency, and last year, I won an Emmy for new approaches to documentary. Can I give you like a 30-second spiel? How's that feel?
Please.
Sweet. Okay. Basically, it was a video project that lived on the internet where we had couples interview each other. It was a very simple mechanic, and we shot these couples. They were beautiful stories, and we quickly realized that no one would watch them because they were 2 minutes long, and it was on the internet. So we built a website where you could interact with the website, and it would cut up these films and create a documentary that was about you and your preferences in a love relationship starring these couples. The Emmy is really hard to decorate with in my apartment. It goes with nothing.
Thank you, Nate.
I am Jonathan Doob, and I get to follow an Emmy Award winner from Google. I don't know how to top that. Congratulations. I work at WME IMG, and I'm overseeing our OTT business there, which is something that we've launched in the past year. We launched our first channel in partnership with Apple TV last year. It's called Made to Measure. It's a fashion OTT network. And since launching with Apple on Apple TV, we've expanded across all other connected TV and mobile and desktop platforms around the world. And now we are working on some additional OTTs, which I can't talk about right now in detail, but the general idea is to continue building out consumer-facing OTT video networks. And can I just ask, I'm just curious, are there any other Emmy Award winners at Google?
Probably.
Just curious.
You do a Google search.
Yeah, I bet there are.
Okay, well, I'm Isaac Josephson, and not for the first time in my life, I'm following John Dube. So I oversee a few different areas at Viacom. It's a relatively new position. The first is a basic product analytics team, so getting past the heartbeat KPIs, diving into the cohorts to figure out what works. The second is a team that builds all of the connected TV apps for Viacom properties. So if you watch, MTV on Roku or Comedy Central on your Apple TV or Nickelodeon on Xbox, that's us. The third team is a white label app platform, and let me tell you what I mean by that. So Nickelodeon and MTV and Comedy Central in the United States have small armies of people dedicated to producing premium mobile native experiences, and they should, because the US is our flagship market and those are our flagship brands. But Viacom has more than 20 brands, and we're in more than 170 countries. So the challenge is providing premium mobile at scale. What we have developed is sort of an Uber app, where if you're in charge of Comedy Central in Germany, you can literally go into your content management system, hook up your content feeds, toggle off a few features, toggle on a few other features, press a button, and out comes apps for you to test and deploy. And then the fourth team is a future of TV type team that's doing a bunch of stuff that I can't talk about right now.
Cool, and so if all of you here have realized, we actually have sort of 3 distinct use cases around creating content. And so really when you start to think about it, the engagement and what is most meaningful to each of them around the engagement of that media that they're creating, it's actually, there's some commonalities here, but really everyone's trying to hit this from a different angle and have different things that are important to them and do have some different challenges. So what I've tried to do here, and my computer's acting a little funky, but what I've tried to do here is to come up with sort of like 3 or 4 main questions that I'd like for us to kind of try to get through, and then later on we can open up some stuff to Q&A, and then I have a bunch of other topics in case all of you in the audience are drawing a blank on what you'd like to follow up with us on. So really the first thing that I'd like to talk about is for each of you within your own brand, there's a lot of different, what I'd like to call real estate of content, and to me at least I see 3 main types. It's owned, so it's content that you're creating for your own brand. There's earned, which is from my perspective is social. So often you're creating social content that you want to ideally use to engage folks further within your brand. And then there's also paid. So in other words, if Nate makes content and I want to distribute that, I will pay him for that content. So guys, and by the way, feel free to bust through the fact that I've narrowed this down to 3, but for each of you respectively, what's the most important content to you and why?
For me, I think the earned is uniquely valuable because if you make an impact at this point in the world, people are going to respond to it. So I think there's a lot of value thinking about content and structuring it in a way where it feels inherently social. If it goes out in the world and people feel like they can be a part of the story, feel like they can dig their fingers into it, then they're going to want to talk about it. And there's nothing more valuable, even going back to the olden days of marketing, than a testimonial. And ultimately, like, earned media is just that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it depends to some degree on what type of business you're running. I've got an ad-supported one right now, and I'm working on some SVOD ones. And I also think it depends on how you define the word valuable, really, because I agree 100% with everything you said in terms of the value of the social stuff. But when you're doing direct sales, the owned platforms to some degree are more valuable in terms of the way you can monetize it. And so in terms of building the brand and building your audience, I think the earned is most valuable in terms of like direct revenue. The paid and the owned can be more valuable depending on the type of content you're creating.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think it depends on what your ultimate goal is and what kind of tools and interaction you can embed in that to make sure that it works. for you?
Right. So for me, a product guy who represents, a whole suite of different brands, this sounds more like an acquisition question. And Viacom is blessed with a massive acquisition engine through its linear broadcasts. In digital, the challenge that we're most excited to address is retention. So taking a look at this, of course, I can talk a lot about own because that's what we own and operate. From an earn perspective, Viacom sort of represents and drives the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist is inherently social these days. In some cases, our footprint in social exceeds that of our footprint in our owned and operated apps and sites, and that's okay because we want to meet users where they are.
The next question I have is around the data that we're all using to try to measure our engagement or as part of our KPIs. And so, for each of you, that could be significantly different. Some folks care about like views and eyeballs. Some folks care about data collection. But for each of you individually, how do you measure the success around your intent of engagement around your media?
Somebody else want to go first this time?
I can go first.
Same.
Yeah. So my favorite answer to this question is the famous Facebook, 7 Friends in 10 Days, right? And they oriented their entire company around getting people to that aha moment, 7 Friends in 10 days. For us, we're still digging into the data. Not still. We are digging into the data to truly isolate that. But I will tell you this, and it's sort of obvious. The more shows you watch, the more likely you are to still be with us 12 weeks into your tenure. And not just episodes of a single show, I mean different shows. So to quantify that a little bit, if you watch 2 different shows on one of our experiences, you're 3 times as likely to still be with us after a quarter. If you watch 4 shows, then you're 700% more likely. So the thing that we're excited about orienting our products to do is get you to discover and habituate to one more show.
I think that's really interesting and a great example of, and I'll call it this because I have a beard and live in Brooklyn, like artisanal metrics, where what the audience response is and how valuable it is depends completely on your audience and what you're trying to get them to do. And I think a really exciting aspect of creating content is really searching for niche embedded data to drive your creative. So really finding some true facts about a community that nobody knows, right? Or problems that people are experiencing that are deep inside of a particular aspect of the culture, and then building a solution to that. And then that means that your KPIs or your metrics at the end of it are going to be really unique to that audience. And that's a great example. Just one more show, and you're that much more likely to participate in the brand overall. When you start thinking about all the different ways people can enter into your brand and the different aspects of the content and the shapes and forms it can take, I think that is a place that should really be kind of drilled into and discovered with whatever it is you're trying to make.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. For the way we're looking at it, it's very much we think about how often are people returning, what % of our users are returning, how much time they're spending watching our videos, how many videos they're watching. We have really high engagement across the board in terms of well over 50% of the people who are viewing our product are coming back and are returning users. And the average time, I think the average time that people are watching, we have long form, short form, and sort of medium form content on there. The majority of our videos on the fashion channel that I mentioned, Made to Measure, are probably about 7 minutes long. The average, but we also have some longer videos that are films. The average time that the returning user is spending, which is much more than the casual user, is 12 minutes. So they're spending significant time. That's per video. Then the average time that they're spending watching the channel as a whole, depending on the platform, ranges from 18 to 33 minutes on average for the returning visitors, which is higher than the people who are more casual. And so those are all metrics that indicate we have strong engagement, and the more people engage with our content, the more likely they are to come back and the more time they spend, which indicates that we're winning people over.
John, have you guys isolated an aha moment in any of your products yet? The activation moment?
In terms of like what triggers them becoming more engaged?
Yeah, like at what point are they habituated?
I would say we probably haven't actually isolated that. The product is about 6 months old, and that's something that we're looking at all of these engagement numbers to try to decipher, because as soon as we can decipher that, then we can just like clone those users over and over again.
It sounds easy to do, but it's not.
Exactly.
Right? And in order to get there, we had to do a deep dive into the data and look at the different cohorts of users, and I think we actually did a quartile analysis on the people that had stayed with us for 12 weeks, isolated the top tier, and like worked backwards from that into their behavior. Yeah.
And one of the challenges, which goes to a conversation that we're having before the panel, around that for us in particular, because the majority of our business is focused on connected TV right now, is that we have inconsistent data across all of the platforms. And so it's very hard to do that for a business that is getting data from Apple and Roku and other platforms, and the data is not consistent. So that's a big challenge in actually doing that. It's much easier when you're looking at a web-specific property, for example.
Yep.
And we don't have the advantages that yourself and some others have of having legacy TV data and audiences as well to match that up against.
And how much can you drill into, for example, what they're doing while they're watching versus device-specific stuff? Obviously, you know when they're watching on mobile versus anywhere else, but time of day or things they might be doing in association. Because I think one thing is, and it goes back to the artisanal metrics, I'm sure there's a better way to talk about that, but people don't consume media like as an activity now, right? It's like always in association with something else.
Yep.
Or often in association with something else. Do you guys look into that, drill into that aspect of it as well?
I think that's a great question. We don't today. It's something that we do talk a lot about. We're working on something that we're hoping to roll out before the end of the year that does start to take into consideration who you are, what your behaviors are at different times during the day and at different days during the week, and then personalizing the experience, not to the exclusion of other things, but surfacing specific elements based on that.
Cool.
Yeah, and just to give you a little bit of insight, one of the questions I had posed for the group was, once we start getting into a world that some of our monetization method is through distribution deals. So if I have a bucket of content and Netflix gives me money to license that for 6 months or a year, the metrics and the analytics that I will get from Netflix just absolutely pale in comparison to what I would get from my own ecosystem, from my own apps, from my own website, my own presentation. And so when you're trying to measure engagement, there's just this interesting challenge that I don't know that there's a good answer to, which is, if I'm trying to increase engagement and I'm like, and for instance, with everyone up here, but even if you think about Isaac at Viacom and just that massive effort that they're putting in across the board, to take their data and to crunch it and massage it and try to figure out how to increase that engagement, the moment that you have a licensing deal where you no longer have those insights for the consumption, it sort of is busting your ability to figure out that engagement model, right? So all of a sudden there's just this like a horse blinder there, and whatever's going on with Netflix, you get some insights back, but certainly Netflix isn't sharing their data. So as a content owner, you want to use all of that data so that you can come back and make really smart decisions about how you're moving forward. But as soon as we start to distribute into platforms on sort of that licensing aspect, we're losing a bunch of stuff there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just a question then based upon that. And I understand, is there a reason why these other content providers, Netflix or wherever, these licensing deals you may have, are not giving you feedback as to the viewership, and when, all the analytics you so desire, have you drilled down as to why they're not? Is there a business reason as to why they're not? Or?
So just for the rest of the audience, the question is like, why isn't Netflix giving content owners that data that can help them to make those good decisions? And I'm just the moderator, so if any of you have a thought around that,
Let's ask the person from Netflix on the panel.
I just thought maybe you guys had that answer, I guess you could say, in some facet.
Well, that data to Netflix is its most important asset. And whether it's Netflix or iTunes or lots of other folks who are distributing your content, at least from my experience, the general rule of thumb is that they're going to give you the least amount of data possible. But I can tell you that it really depends on the individual licensing deal, right? So Viacom may have a lot more clout to try to derive, some data from Netflix as opposed to NPR, for instance. And so he might get a lot more data than I do, but that really depends on that initial contract that he might be penning with Netflix. But in general, and I'm happy for somebody to say otherwise, but in general, none of us are ever getting like the quality of metrics and analytics out of a Netflix that we could derive out of our own ecosystem media.
You control that. You control that as through Viacom and everything else. You control that. If they're interacting with your app, you know how they're interacting with it and when, and etc.
Yeah, and so what you were saying is that as long as it stays within your own ecosystem, you have more control over that engagement, and you absolutely do. And I think that's an issue that a lot of us, as we're talking about distributing to social platforms with different media. So if somebody's sending content to Facebook, for instance, I think a big place that most of us miss the boat on is that call to action, right? Because if I'm putting that out on Facebook, I might get eyeballs, but what's the real value that I'm deriving from that other than maybe some brand engagement with folks who might not have previously engaged with me? But how do I even measure that? Because what Facebook tells me is I had X number of views, but they're not giving me necessarily good quality analytics around there, and there's certainly no trail that I can track easily from Facebook back to my own properties to figure out like how effective was that social post. So it's really interesting. You look like you need to jump in and stop me from talking.
Was I making a weird, annoying face while you were talking about it? No, I think I was looking at the list and it says meaningful content, and this is optimistic conjecture, but I think that we're in an exciting time when it comes to like data in general, right? Like you realize that one more show has this huge impact on your brand overall. And I don't know if anybody saw the University of Wisconsin Snapchat rom-com. Anybody? Big Snapchat? So this lady sees this guy in the cafeteria, makes a little snap about it. Hey, you're cute, meet me here at 3 a.m. or whatever. He responds, and the entire campus and then all of Snapchat gets involved in this conversation, and it becomes this like huge explosive online thing, and ultimately potentially like a new genre. And the impact of that conversation, I think, is really exciting, and potentially as these like we get access to new forms of information and everything, there are ways to uncover what meaningful content is, what valuable metadata is, as we go in real time. And I think there's probably a lot of like interesting places to uncover different forms of content and the way we're distributing stuff.
And Isaac, I know, based on this particular question that we're sort of in the middle of, you guys are obviously doing a tremendous amount of work at taking the data that you're collecting and figuring out how that can be valuable to you. And you're, often. So I guess my question is that generally the tact that you might have to take is to sort of look at the data and then back into the plan based on the data? Or do you ever find that your data is allowing you to do like modeling, forward thinking as well? Like how, and just clear it up for me, like how does that work with you guys?
So the team that we put together in my group at Viacom has research, like usability testing and user interviews and focus groups, and product analytics, not just like heartbeat metrics that you could pull from Site Catalyst, but like proactive mining of the data, doing longitudinal analysis, looking at cohorts, that sort of thing. These two functions, product analytics and user research, are embedded in the product development process as much as design, product management, and engineering are. And it's a team that works together through everything. And they collectively, through these different things, form a hypothesis and test the hypothesis. And then based on the outcome of that hypothesis, we either release it to the broader audience or we kill it.
Mm-hmm. And John, for you guys, when you're looking at your analytics, today, are you flexible enough to sort of be making tweaks to your presentation or even to what content you're taking in? Whether and by the way, I'm not sure. Are you generally is your content generally outsourced, or are you guys producing a lot of your own content?
We're producing our own content. A lot of it is through freelancers and agencies, but
Yep.
I have a team that works for me that's responsible for it, and so we do have a lot of different people we work with. And so to answer your question, we are very much focused on the OTT space in particular, and all the connected TV platforms, and that because that space is very much evolving, and because the channel that we've created is still relatively young, very much we're doing exactly what you said in that we're looking at the analytics, looking at what's creating engagement, and thinking about what the right type of content is and what the right type of mix is, and then as we go forward, we're trying new types of content. We're experimenting with length and format and everything else.
And I imagine that it can be a struggle because often when you're producing content and you're planning that out, it's often pretty far in advance, and so it's a struggle to take those metrics and then sort of be able to translate that into something actionable moving forward sometimes, because you might have the option to, I'll show this show instead of that show because my analytics are insinuating that this would be more successful. But even in terms of creating content, it's very difficult to take those analytics and actually translate that into new production of new material. Mm-hmm. And I actually think out of everyone on stage that Nate, you're probably, and the way that you traditionally have been making content, you're probably the most flexible out of all of us because you're not only are you creating content all the time, but often I would imagine even though you care about the past performance of stuff, really for you each time you're making content, it's almost like a new opportunity, for potentially a brand new type of engagement with people.
Yeah, I think at the heart of most things that I've worked on in the branded space or in the agency space, video plays a huge part of it, but we're always looking to innovate the entry point and ultimately give people a new disruptive way to encounter something that they're very familiar with. So if I think about the Oreo tweet and the Arby's tweet. They were both beautiful. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? With the Oreo Super Bowl tweet, and then there was the Arby's Pharrell hat tweet. Both kind of blew up the internet. But the Oreos one is one that people still refer to because it was the first one, and every single great brand tweet after that is going to be somehow derivative of that. So how do you find new entry points to give people something to look at that isn't just great content, but is a new way and a new form to encounter that? So we say if you make a great comic book, the greatest comic book ever, it's going to be another great comic book. But if you take that comic book and release it on YouTube and somehow make a YouTube video that is a comic book, people will encounter that and be like, this is the greatest YouTube comic book I've ever seen before. And it gets that much more social currency, drives engagement, and you ultimately have a deeper connection to those folks than you would have if you just put out the same content in the form factor that has worked so many times. And I realize that is that idea of disrupting what's worked can be controversial, but I think it's an exciting place to play because we haven't figured out any of this, right? The form factor is constantly changing. It's a new VR headset, then a new VR headset. It's 360, it's immersive, the screens are getting bigger, they're changing shape. So how can we kind of look at these platforms and recombine them or figure out ways that we can get people and pull them in an exciting way that they didn't see coming?
Are any of you doing sort of second screen activities? Isaac, I know you're probably the most likely, but do any of you sort of have engagement activities outside of the video that's meant to be complementary to the video engagement itself?
Well, those are two questions, right? I think, look, we're always experimenting with second screen. And depending on the brand, right, because we've got MTV, we've got Comedy Central, but then we've got Nick Jr., there are different ways that you can engage your audience outside of video. For Nick and Nick Jr., games is almost as much of a focus as video. And in fact, overall, if you went into one of our Nick or Nick Jr. products, you'd see it's more about play than about utility, which is what it is in the products for the older demographics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think gamification is a huge thing around a lot of brands these days, and sort of that extension of fodder for them to be able to increase engagement around the brand. And it's probably something that a lot of folks at these conferences are barely starting to talk about yet. I know we're totally into the VR and AR thing, but gamification is huge for a lot of brands, and I think you've probably been exposed to some of that in the past as well, around not just presenting like video or media, but really what creative ways can you come up with to actually almost have like a gamification element where you're increasing that engagement.
Yeah, I'll share a metaphor. If that's cool. The way I think about it is as an amusement park, ultimately. There's a big sign in the front of the media landscape, and that might have the name of a brand on it or some sort of theme that connects this experience. You walk in, and then there's all these disparate content experiences. In an amusement park, it might be different rides. The way it works here is different video pieces of content. It could be series, could be one-offs. Maybe there's a Twitter experience over here. And the goal, I think, is to get people to enter into a media landscape or an ecosystem or whatever word you want to use for it. And the more they play, the more they engage, the more value they get out of it. And that ultimately really maps to a gamification model in a cool way, especially when you think about the way gamification exists in our everyday life. Your credit card is a game. Your cell phone bill is a game. People are very used to engaging with things, getting a reward, and then having that motivate, more participation. So there's always gamification going on. I think it's about, can we identify it and then elevate it so that the user's aware of it, and it doesn't feel necessarily like Farmville, like where it's like I'm playing a game, but I'm just engaging with this, and the more I do it, the cooler it is.
Right. We should be careful not to conflate gamification with games, right?
Yeah.
So for Nick and Nick Jr., games are a very big part of the experience. I wouldn't call them fodder for more engagement with the brand. I would call them increasingly linked to the heart and soul of the brand, because that's what kids ages 3 to 11, Nick Jr., like. To your point, Nathan, gamification is just simply the act of taking an investment that your audience has already made thus far and using that investment to draw them deeper into the experience. That you can and should do anywhere.
And I think we're getting, our audience is so savvy and so immersed in all this content and everything that we've gathered. Just being nerdy at this point is a form of gamification. The fact that we can sit down and identify someone as a fellow player and make Star Trek references back and forth, that's great fodder for the Star Trek brand to be able to build on, you know what I mean?
And I apologize for introducing the word fodder into our conversation. So on to the next slide, making money. So in general, there's a number of different ways that people can make money off of content. Some of the main categories are subscription, subscription, sponsored, and paid. I might have gotten that last one wrong.
Ad revenue.
Ad revenue. So for you guys, what's more important? Or do we care more about eyeballs? Do we care about increasing brand engagement? What's the main KPI for success there? And really, what is making us or you guys the most money right now, without giving up any secret sauce?
John?
I mean, I think again the answer to this. I'll talk specifically about one of the channels we're working on, but it does depend on what type of a business you're running. Again, and obviously you're focusing this question on advertising, but I do want to mention that because we're working on an SVOD channel, I think that's a very, very strong way to make money in this space. And when you are doing an SVOD product, then engagement is by far the most important thing because you want to retain that audience. In terms of the AVOD products and others out there, I would say, again, it depends on the type of business you're running. The one that we are doing is in the fashion space, and it's aimed at a specific demographic, and we are targeting luxury advertisers, and we are doing a lot of branded content. And so for us, it is very much about engagement and around specific targeted segments. That is very different from some media brands like a BuzzFeed or others that are going for massive scale. So when you're talking about questions like that, you're either going for massive scale because there is so much scale out there now when you're playing the eyeballs game. And if you're not competing at that level, then I think owning a very specific demographic and having a highly engaged ownership of that demographic is very key.
Yeah, I think, again, and this is my own personal perspective, it's not related to the brand that I'm working for right now, but so to put what's making you the most money side, I think no matter what, you can't forget about brand engagement, because ultimately, banner ads are great at measuring things and potentially can build money, but there's something to be said for people loving your brand and having something which is impervious to a reactionary audience, something that really stands for something, and building that brand and that voice and that image requires constant attention. In the old days when if there was an editorial in Playboy about cigars and you would buy an ad for your cigar brand right here, advertising was easy, right? And it was hard to kind of break a brand, but now you really need to focus on what we stand for, especially because audiences can take so much ownership of it. So I think even the act of making money requires thinking about how people are engaging with your brand and the larger story you're telling. And I think it's hard with all the channels and all the entry points to manage that and maintain any sort of control over it.
So totally agree. Just to build on that a little bit, I think the answer to your either or question is yes. Look, for the single brand app experiences in the media industry that is tied to traditional media, the primary use case is catch up for the superfan who missed an episode of Younger or Teen Wolf or whatever it is they missed an episode of. And that's great, and we want to serve them and we want to deepen their engagement. But it's also incumbent upon us to think about how we can build a bigger audience and further engage all of our users, bring them into watching 1, 2, 3, 4 more shows. And I think the really interesting question, the one that we ask ourselves all the time, is how do we do that, right? And that's when you get into questions about TVE and sort of reducing the friction inherent in that experience, and questions of to what extent can we leverage short form as an on-ramp for watching one more show or as an end in of itself. That's where games come into play for the kids.
Yeah, and I think that sort of leads us into, even though I have some more questions, although we've done an amazing job filling up our slot, is for all of us respectively, do we have any respective discovery models that we're using to try to increase engagement? And are you able to speak on that, on your company's ways of trying to suggest content, but in a way that is going to increase engagement and might not just be your typical metadata keyword related suggestions?
Sure. So one of the coolest things that I've seen from a discovery perspective is the Sony View UI. It takes a lot of the benefits of linear TV. Remember when you would sit down on your couch, turn on your remote, and you would just be immediately immersed in something, and you'd figure out, oh my God, 20 minutes have gone by, and I've been watching Jumanji. And then you'd flip the channel, and there'd be a rerun of Family Ties, or whatever it is. And you would let the content immerse you. So Sony View, with its instantaneous play, leverages that, but it marries it with all the benefits of VOD, which allows you to watch whatever you want, whenever you want. So I think there's a real opportunity there that we're excited to explore in our products and have taken some steps in that direction.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, Nate.
Just the Spotify Discover Weekly playlist is blowing my mind.
It is good.
Well,
It's
yeah.
really
So NPR, we have an app called NPR One, and the idea of it, even though it's all audio based, it's sort of like Pandora for NPR content. And just in case any of you in the room are actually measuring stuff like per unique, how long is somebody actually sticking with you? And I don't mean coming back a few times during the day, I just mean per unique session, how long is somebody staying with you? We're getting over 40 minutes per unique, which I've never met anyone yet that says like, oh, we're pretty close to that.
Is that per session or per month or per decade?
That is every time on average that somebody starts the NPR One app, we're getting over 40 minutes.
So it's a per session. That's pretty impressive.
It's crazy when you think about that we don't cull out, if somebody's only on for 10 or 15 seconds, like we're still counting that. We're not counting that as like an error session. And so for us, I can tell you that it's sort of a combination of both machine curated algorithm to decide what should float up to the surface for all of you individually. But then we also have editorial folks that are actually spending time to make sure that even if you're indicating that you don't like elections coverage, but you do like international coverage, that occasionally we're still going to give you some election coverage pieces because we feel like it might be that important for you to get that. And then we're also doing some really cool stuff around like localizing that to help our public radio model and the way that we support all of the member stations.
Mike, have you correlated that to use cases like commuting versus in-home versus playing hopscotch?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of folks who consume us during a commute, but this app is not an offline app. So for instance, for the folks that are like on a subway or on a plane or in one of those situations where they're like captured and you'd like to think, hey, Mike flies 6 hours across the country, maybe that's a 6-hour addition to, that's not the case at all. So it's everything right now is connected, but certainly we do have a ton of folks who are listening to us on their commute, and so that does absolutely contribute positively to that number. But I'll tell you, in the past, when I'm talking with a major sports institution and they're telling me that a video that lasts longer than 15 seconds on their front page gets significant drop off by people, and the struggle is real, right? Like especially if you're going to monetize your content with ads, how do you put a 30-second ad in front of a 15-second piece of content? And I'll tell you, you can start thinking of some entities that do that, and I have difficulty consuming media from those places because it's just painful for me to sit through that long of an ad. But it's really interesting because I do think that for all of us, we've got this amazing blend of sort of like, especially when we're talking about television, you have this amazing blend now of linear content, but with people that also want to be able to pick and choose what they want to consume, right? And so my mom, when I cut the cord for her, it took her 3 weeks before she ordered cable again. And it's because she missed her form of discovery was flipping through the channel button. That's how she discovers, right? My kids do not watch linear TV at all. Not one bit. Not even for sports or anything. Like everything is some sort of OTT, avenue into that big screen for them, or even their phone. And so it's your Netflix's, Hulu's, YouTube. Oh my gosh, and don't get me wrong, as a video person, I love YouTube as part of the ecosystem, but it drives me crazy to watch my kids like watch somebody play a video game for 2 hours, and like, you know, that's, to them though, that's real content and they're actually getting engaged in it. So as much as I have difficulty like understanding why that happens, the bottom line is that that happens. And so, you know, and Isaac, I know you were telling me that that you thought that some of the stickiest content out there for engagement was around children's content.
Well, I think Netflix proved that a while ago. Which is what caused them to build out to blow out their kids section.
Yep.
It's a great retention driver.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you hear about Bob Ross on Twitch?
No.
Bob Ross, the painter.
I did hear about this.
Twitch
Yeah.
is the video game network where people live stream video games, and someone posted Bob Ross's entire oeuvre of TV shows on Twitch, and good numbers for like a stream on Twitch are like, let's say like 5,000 plus, and consistently for the entire run of Bob Ross's entire TV show,
You should
he
say
had
who
like
Bob Ross is.
20,000 viewers at any given point. So Bob Ross is like the happy little trees guy on PBS.
Teach you to paint.
Yeah, teach you how to paint, and he blew up the channels that your kids are watching, which I think is like, I don't know what the implications are, but they're interesting. And everyone's a really good painter now on Twitch.
So, folks, I've already run past time here, so I certainly don't want to keep you all, but I will go to the next slide so you can see what we won't be talking about. But I'm happy for us to spend a couple of minutes for Q&A. So whether some of this sparks something in you or whether you have some of your own questions, does anyone have any questions for us before we adjourn? Yes.
Of the OTT devices that you guys are putting content up on today, are there some that you feel better represent your content, and or do you have any different analytics that show that there's better consumption on one device than another?
So the question, just for those of you that might not have heard it, is out of the OTT ecosystem, are there any particular devices that are better suited to some of the respective content owners up here on stage, and are metrics playing into which direction any of them are heading toward with a particular OTT box or destination?
For us, it's Apple TV, partially because we've been partners with Apple and they've been very supportive, and also we're on both the old and the new Apple TV, which has helped given us a very large audience because you're pre-installed on the older Apple TV, which is no longer the case on the newer one.
For us, look, at this point, they're all more or less the same. We're excited by the new Roku SDK. We're excited by the new Apple TV because we believe that they will give us the opportunity to innovate in ways that we couldn't before.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Nate, does that, it's interesting because when you make content, I feel like, and I'm probably wrong, but I feel like you don't actually care sometimes like where it's going out. You care more about like the experience that you're trying to create. But that said, are there any particular mediums, whether it's OTT or otherwise, that you find you have the best, results from whatever effort that you're putting in?
Well, I think we do think about the content map and how people are going to engage in it, and it completely depends on if it's an ad campaign, how we want people to track, and ultimately it's not static, you know what I mean? So it really depends on the thing, because I'm not dealing with one particular media channel and trying to get it out there. So I'm going to abstain from that question.
Sort of. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what kind of third-party apps do you guys use to increase engagement for your content?
So the question is, what sort of third-party apps are we using to increase engagement around content? Is that anything any of you are able to?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that question.
It's a tough question because often it's sort of breaking. A lot of us aren't supposed to talk about completely about the inner workings, but maybe you can follow up with me afterwards and maybe we'll have a chat. I see a hand up over there.
Yeah, so we're talking about analytics and engagement. What are some of the metrics you guys think are most important in relating to engagement? So key metrics for engagement.
So the question is, when you're measuring your engagement, what is it that you're actually looking for? What's most important to you?
In the data.
Meaning which data points?
Yeah, or like maybe, yeah.
I mean, for us, it's the ones that I mentioned earlier. It's how often are people returning? How much time are they spending with their content? How many videos are they actually watching? And then also the differentiation among the different profiles. For example, how long are people staying and watching your videos among those who are returning visitors versus people who are just the flyby? So the more you break that out, the more you get a better understanding of your audience.
So for me, we divide it into two different types of metrics. We've got heartbeat metrics, and those are basically all the ones that you're talking about. And every product owner, can recite their heartbeat metrics in their sleep. Most of the time, you can get those. You can pull those out of Adobe Site Catalyst. Some people have, homegrown systems. You can get Google Analytics. The second piece is the deeper product analytics, and that's when you need to use tools like Tableau or SQL or something like that to take a look at the different cohorts and follow their behavior over time.
I know, at least from our end, we also do a lot of internal A/B testing. So we're trying things out sort of live in production, and we try to. A lot of our stuff is homegrown, but we do try to make decisions on the fly based on a lot of A/B testing that we're doing throughout a lot of our products.
I have a question for Isaac. Just curious about the platform you mentioned about Uber platform. Is it all native or are you using?
Yeah, it's all native. We've got an iOS and an Android, and we are talking about extending those, logical extension, to tvOS and Android TV, Fire TV.
There's no cross-platform tools. Everything.
Well, the front-end experience is entirely native, but the back-end is shared.
So, folks, I apologize. I was given the wrap it up B motion from the good folks here at Streaming Media East. So, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. A few of us will be sticking around. So, if any of you have any extra questions or want to follow up, we're here. So, thank you again.